Bates College and at Yale University. He's worked for the Asia Foundation, the ADB, and also the British Foreign Office. And his work has focuses on the politics of Islamic institutions, drawing attention to the ways in which political processes lend themselves to notions of democracy. And finally, most of our fellows and scholars come to the Wilson Center and subsequently publish a book after the fact. Matt, however, is somewhat special in that regard. He's just had a book published while he's still here, and on a topic separate from his Wilson Center project. It's called In the Shadow of Sharia, Islam, Islamic Law, and Democracy in Pakistan, published by Columbia University Press. So congratulations. Father's Day is coming up, so for those of you thinking that a father somewhere may be interested in such a topic, and I'm sure there are many fathers that are, it would make a good gift, I'm sure. So I will cede the floor to Matt. After Matt speaks, we'll have a Q&A. So, Matt.
Thanks, Michael. Actually, I think mine isn't. There we go. Is that working now? Does everyone have one of these little handouts that were out on the table? That's just a little excerpt from the Constitution of Pakistan. If not, I'll be referring to it in the talk and so on, and you might find it interesting. It actually brings the issue of religious education directly into the Pakistan Constitution and speaks directly to some of the issues that I'll be addressing, particularly regarding some of the differences between Muslims and how that element of sectarianism is addressed in the context of schools. Of course, I want to start off by thanking the Wilson Center for letting me be here this spring for both scholars and policymakers and people like me who like to spend time with both. This is a truly remarkable place. The project that I'm going to talk about this afternoon focuses on the ways in which different types of religious education in Pakistan have led local Muslims to deal with some of the differences amongst Muslims, religious, sectarian, and doctrinal differences in different ways. I begin with the simple fact that Muslims disagree with one another. In fact, they disagree with one another about Islam. And then with this in mind, I tried to understand the ways in which across several different types of educational institutions, Muslims in Pakistan have been taught to deal with these disagreements amongst Muslims in a variety of different ways. Broadly, the project that I've been working on focuses on the formation of religious ideas. And within this, the formation of particular types of religious and political subjectivities. As the project unfolds, I've chosen to focus on three very different types of subjectivities. The first is associated with the work of the Pakistani state. And in the state schools that I'll discuss, the issue of sectarian and doctrinal difference is simply ignored. In the second setting, I look at the work of local madrasas. And here, the terms of difference that I'll focus on are somewhat reluctantly acknowledged. And finally, I'll look at a particular group of individual Muslims. And in this particular group of individual Muslims that I'll highlight, the terms of difference are occasionally embraced, actively and enthusiastically embraced. And my question across these groups is quite simple. The question is, how do specific religious ideas originate? And then which religious ideas contribute to which political subjectivities? So where do different Islamic ideas about difference, sectarian or doctrinal difference, where do these different ideas come from, and then what are their political effects? Now, in the book that Michael just mentioned, the one that's been published just recently by Columbia, I drew attention to a deeply rooted sensibility within the Pakistani public. And the sensibility was that the terms of Islamic law are immune to disagreement. And then, having drawn attention to that sensibility, I spelled out some of the implications of this perspective, that the terms of Islam, and particularly Islamic law, are immune to disagreement, the implications of that for the shape of political and especially electoral accountability. I focused on landed property disputes, a very common type of dispute in Pakistan, and I noted that contrary to conventional notions of electoral accountability, most of the Muslims I encountered in my work didn't believe that their elected representatives should debate and then occasionally amend the Islamic laws that governed their property. Instead, perhaps understandably, many Muslims had a tendency to regard the terms of Islamic law as fixed, immune to disagreement. In fact, more often than not, they simply called on their elected representatives, as I discuss in this book, not to amend the Islamic laws that governed their property, but just to avoid those Islamic laws. And I found that cooperative efforts to avoid the active implementation and enforcement of Islamic laws governing property slowly emerged as a very common expression of political accountability. Help me to avoid the law, and I'll vote for you again. Clearly, local ideas about the static nature of Islamic law were politically significant in that account. But the question that I've come to now is, what led local Muslims throughout Pakistan to believe that the terms of Islam and Islamic law were impervious to disagreement in the first place? How should we understand the source of their religious ideas? Who taught local Muslims to think this way about the terms of Islam? Was it the state? Was it the madrasa? Perhaps some combination of both. Now, within Pakistan, we're all familiar, I think, by now, with the notion that specific institutions are involved in the production of specific religious ideas. Different institutions, different ideas. In fact, by now, we're all pretty well acquainted with the notion that different types of schools, public schools, private schools, madrasas, for instance, each of these aim to engage the terms of Islam in ways that produce a particular type of subjectivity. Within the existing literature, I found that we see an argument in which madrasas, organized along sectarian lines, they tend to produce extremely poor, economically poor students who are, in any case, we're told, particularly intolerant of difference. And then public schools, catering to the lower middle classes, they're said to produce a slightly higher level of tolerance. And perhaps, not surprisingly, Pakistan's elite English medium academies are said to produce the most tolerant students of all. Now, this work, following in the footsteps of people like Tariq Rahman in Islamabad, whose work is, I think, quite well known by now, this work derives its understanding of local attitudes, tolerance and so on, from a straightforward class analysis. Your class determines your school, and then your school defines your ideas. But in practice, this rather common class-based assessment has been challenged by scholars with an interest in school choice. These scholars have stressed the fact that many parents, including many middle-class parents, even upper-class parents, actually choose to provide some of their children with a madrasa-based religious education. Some families will just send their child to a madrasa early in the morning and then shift that child over to a government school later in the day. Others will call the mullah from their madrasa to teach their children at home. Other families will simply enroll their child in a madrasa for a few years until they're able to save up enough to afford another type of school, for example, a local private school, and so on and so forth. Actually, the permutations of all of these different types of schools are practically endless. In 2006, though, the World Bank sought to dismiss this focus on madrasas altogether. They argued that very few parents actually choose a madrasa education for their children at all. This study, this 2006 study from the World Bank, is now probably the most widely cited study regarding education in Pakistan. Unfortunately, this study was deeply flawed. In particular, the World Bank opted to document only full-time madrasa enrollments, full-time residential enrollments. And they noted that, quote, fewer than 2% of all children were actually living in a madrasa. And with this in mind, they leapt to the conclusion that madrasas were statistically unimportant. But of course, this conclusion was a bit misplaced. As I'll explain in a moment, the fraction of those enrolled in local madrasas on a part-time, non-residential basis is more than 70%. Now, in recent years, I think scholars and policymakers have suffered from a profound lack of data regarding existing enrollment patterns in Pakistan, including enrollment patterns involving several different types of schools simultaneously, as I've indicated. There are, quote, no data on the part-time utilization of religious schools. This is from Chris Fair over at Georgetown just a couple of years ago. She said, research on this issue is urgently needed because encouraging parents to opt out of the madrasa system could help to discourage the production of what she called intolerant worldviews. Needless to say, the literature on religious education has been obsessed with the role of madrasas in producing specific patterns of intolerance. I'm sure we've all read more than our share of articles about madrasas and intolerance in Pakistan. Now, in recent years, some people have attempted to stress the role of public and private schools as well. But even today, I'd say the existing literature is plagued by problems, most of which still relate to the basic issue of enrollments. And I'll start there with the data a bit later on. With respect to the most tolerant, quote unquote, the most tolerant elite private schools, getting to some of these different enrollment concerns. Scholars have consistently failed to appreciate the extent to which super elite private schools in Pakistan, the schools that prepare their students for international exams like the British A-levels and so on, these schools enroll just an incredibly tiny fraction of the total student population, less than 0.5%. In my data, less than 0.2%. And of course, as you probably know, even these schools have been shown to contribute to the problem of global terrorism. As one of my former students at Yale, Swati Pandey, pointed out with Peter Bergen, most of the world's leading Muslim terrorists received their education not in a madrasa, but rather in an elite English medium school. If we move on to Pakistan's non-elite private schools, though, we have to keep in mind that these non-elite private schools differ very little, I would argue hardly at all, at the level of curricular content from Pakistan's public schools. The recent explosion of private sector schools in Pakistan, and there has been an explosion of private sector schooling in Pakistan, this explosion scarcely figures at all in any sophisticated analysis of religious or political tolerance, mostly because in practice these private schools adhere to government-sanctioned textbooks in a bid to prepare their students for routine government exams. The exceptions, of course, will be those extremely elite private schools. And of course, there are some NGO schools catering to a very small portion of the student population that also have their own quite innovative textbooks. In any case, what we notice is that divergent ideas, particularly with respect to the problem of Muslim difference, which I'll focus on in a minute, these divergent ideas do not emerge in public and private schools generally. Instead, they emerge in the gap between public and private schools on the one hand, schools that ignore the terms of difference in their curriculum, and on the other hand, local madrasas, which go out of their way to acknowledge forms of sectarian or doctrinal difference. But the main challenge does not lie in drawing attention to the differences between schools and madrasas. The main challenge lies in realizing that most children engage both types of institutions simultaneously. The main challenge lies in grappling with the fact that as students move across these different types of institutions, in an incredible mix, most children encounter two very different approaches to the terms of difference at the same time. In the context of their local madrasa, as I noted, they learn to recognize the terms of doctrinal difference and then distinguish those terms. And in the context of their local school, they learn to ignore the terms of difference altogether. Okay. The Urdu language textbook for class 10, for instance, notes, quote, "As Pakistanis, we have faith in one God, one prophet, and one holy book. So it's binding on us that we should be one as a nation also. We are not Pakistanis now, or excuse me, we are all Pakistanis now, not Balochis, not Sindhis, not Pathans." Or as one of my research assistants pointed out, having gone through hundreds of primary and secondary textbooks, quote, "Sectarian differences are never mentioned in any textbook whatsoever, despite being one of the most important issues facing Pakistan today." Now, all of this hybridity that I've been discussing at the level of enrollment patterns makes it very difficult, I would argue impossible, to link particular sets of ideas to isolated forms of singular or full-time enrollment. A deeper understanding, I argue, of prevailing part-time enrollments has a tendency to push us beyond any explanation of tolerance focused on the work of isolated institutions. Instead, we have to move towards an appreciation for the interpretive agency of educated Muslim individuals. This question, who thinks what, frankly, is no longer a question that can be answered with any simple institutional analysis. Which institution produces which strain of thought? Instead, we have to move on to a greater appreciation for what I call the interpretive faculties of relatively autonomous individuals, how they stitch the pieces of the educational landscape together for themselves. Now, in a moment, at the end, I'm going to introduce you to some of these thinking individuals in a brief film. But before I do, I'm going to address two further bits of the conventional wisdom regarding both schools and madrasas, two bits of the conventional wisdom that I take up and challenge in the context of my project. First, with reference to the Islamic studies curriculum in local government schools, it's important to note that the homogenizing see no difference rhetoric of the state, this did not emerge for the first time under General Zia-ul-Haq during the 1980s and the Afghan Jihad. These patterns took shape much earlier. In fact, as my research unfolded, I quickly realized that the state's aggressively assimilationist approach first took shape in the context of a concerted effort to rally the Islamic nation of Pakistan against sort of brewing forms of Bengali and Balochi provincialism during the late 1940s. In fact, this homogenizing rhetoric emerged in November 1947 with the first articulation of the education coordinator, or whatever his title was, Fazlur Rahman. If we move away from government schools for a moment to the madrasas, I also argue that we need to challenge existing tendencies to map the terms of tolerance along explicitly sectarian lines. Keep in mind that the madrasas in Pakistan are organized according to sect and subsect. Shia madrasas, Sunni madrasas, among Sunni madrasas, different types of Sunni expression. But we have to avoid the tendency to map the terms of tolerance onto those distinctions. There is, I would argue, no such thing as an intrinsically tolerant sect or subsect in Pakistan. On the contrary, the Sunnis compete with the Shias. And among the Sunnis, several different subgroups compete, often violently, with one another. Baralvis versus Deobandis, Deobandis versus Salafis, or Ahl Hadith, as they're known in Pakistan, and so on. Broadly speaking, this means that the only defensible empirical position about sectarian differentiation lies in realizing that each sect is simply devoted to a particular and competing understanding of orthodoxy. And throughout Pakistan, again, understandably, most people simply seek to endorse a notion of orthodoxy that includes them. For some, it's a Muslim versus non-Muslim distinction, India, Pakistan, Muslim-Christian. For others, it's a Sunni-Shia distinction. For others, Sunni A versus Sunni B, and so on. Which orthodoxy includes me? That is the orthodoxy I endorse. The problem lies in the fact that precisely insofar as these alternative orthodoxies persist, and they will persist, the mixed enrollment patterns that I mentioned, they feed into sharply cross-cutting trends. On the one hand, recalling the views articulated in local schools, most Pakistanis insist that for the sake of the nation, there should be only one Islam, only one approach to the terms of Islamic orthodoxy. And yet at the same time, recalling the influence of their local madrasa, most Pakistanis also tend to believe that insofar as there can be only one Islam, that one should reflect their own sectarian views. Consider, if you will, this little snippet, this little bit from one of our earliest interviews. Quote, do you think, this is from our interviews, do you think that in the context of Islamic studies, Islamiyat, schools should employ different teachers for different texts, different teachers for different sects, or one teacher for everyone? Most people would say, oh, one teacher for everyone. Okay, we'd say, if you're a Sunni, would you be happy if your child's teacher were a Shia? Oh no, not at all. Right. Okay, why should Sunni teachers prevail? Well, because Sunnis are in the majority. Okay, if the population of each sect were exactly the same, do you believe that each sect should receive equal attention in the curriculum? Of course. But exactly equal populations? That's impossible. As our work unfolded, we began to notice that most people were not actually terribly concerned about the teaching of religious truth with a capital T. Instead, they were concerned about majoritarianism and the notion that ultimately religious truth was basically a function of community-based sectarian control. Religion, if you will, was always already political. In fact, for most people, the first priority lay in finding a majority that would include them. For some, Baralvi. For others, we are all Muslim. Whatever. After doing that, most people simply hope to ignore the possibility of any difference altogether. They'd say, इख्तिलाफात के बारे में बात करके लड़ाई शुरू होती है, हमें चुप रहना चाहिए. Or, people fight if they talk about differences. We should just keep quiet. One of our respondents, I thought, summed it up especially well, this very key point. He said, जब सब बिल्कुल एक जैसे हैं, तो सब बराबर होते हैं. झगड़ा का मतलब जाहल है. When everyone is exactly the same, equality itself is enhanced. Difference implies disagreement, and disagreement implies a deep lack of religious understanding, jahiliya. This was, of course, a rather widespread view. In fact, this was precisely the view that we see on these two posters. Why are we not one? Now, on the margins, some seek to advance their own understanding of Islam with violence. Okay, these are, of course, the jihadis. Very small group. For the most part, though, my project is focused on the opposite end of the spectrum. Those mixed education Muslims who believe that, practically speaking, there is never one Islam. These are the people for whom, quote unquote, the sin of pride, that is, the notion that one might actually know God's truth, they regard this sin as the greatest sin of all. The question is, where does this group come from? If in practice, their diversity-friendly ideas cannot be tied to the influence of any one isolated institution. So over time, my attempt to trace the source of this diversity-friendly set of ideas, this attempt has taken shape over the course of two different types of data collection strategies, one largely quantitative and one broadly qualitative. This is where we come to the nuts and bolts of the data. I worked with a group from the Gallup organization in Islamabad to initially identify, in sort of a third round of interviews, we identified a nationally representative sample of 500 respondents across 50 different locations throughout Pakistan, cities, towns, tiny villages, all 4 provinces, and so on. And we did that to determine who studies where in ways that might begin to estimate the level of part-time mixed institutional enrollments, the data that we never had. I also sought to determine who thinks what about the terms of doctrinal difference, who ignores the terms of difference, who acknowledges the terms of difference, and so on. And the challenge, of course, lay in linking these different approaches to difference to specific variations in prior educational experience. If we turn to the first question, who studies where, I have to start by saying that within my sample, about 10% were unable to provide their children with any formal education whatsoever. But among those who did educate their children, a very clear majority favored both schools and madrasas. These are the mixed enrollments. Working with 3 quite outstanding research assistants from Lahore, we discovered that this preference for mixed institutional enrollments was practically ubiquitous. The rich, the poor, the urban, the rural, the Sunni, the Shia, almost every demographic cleavage followed this pattern. But I should point out that among the illiterate rural poor, completely illiterate rural poor, the statistical minority who sought to privilege the work of a single madrasa was a little bit higher. Still a minority that privileged just one institution, but slightly higher. Now, with reference to school-based education, we followed most of the existing literature, and we found that 71% attended public schools and 29% attended ordinary private schools, a number that probably is growing. Although, as noted above, we have to remember that these two different types of schools differ very little at the level of curricular content. In any case, with respect to madrasa-based enrollments, our data were very clear. First, in keeping with the World Bank data mentioned earlier, we found that fewer than 2% of all madrasa students were full-time residential students. Non-residential students brought this full-time figure to 4%. Okay? But on a part-time basis, madrasa-based enrollments increased dramatically. Even apart from the 8% who called the mullah from the madrasa to teach their children at home, fully 69% traveled to their local madrasa during the morning or afternoon. Clearly, most children receive their mullah or madrasa-based religious education on a part-time basis. This means that at the level of ideas, they encounter several different influences simultaneously. Now, in order to study the impact of these competing influences, these hybrid enrollments, we also sought to determine the extent to which people felt differences should be ignored, acknowledged, or embraced. Should the existence, for instance, of Deobandi and Barelvi Sunnis be mentioned in the context of a local school? Should the fact that Sunnis and Shias employ different prayer styles be explained by local mullahs? Well, initially, we asked our respondents whether the existence of different sects should be mentioned in the context of local schools, and 63% said no, don't mention it. We then explained that really everyone knows that Sunnis and Shias have different prayer styles. And we asked people, once again, whether these differences should be mentioned or ignored. This time, 65% said differences should be ignored. Although again, it's worth noting that contrary to the conventional wisdom, this denial of difference actually increased slightly with income. The wealthier were more reluctant to mention difference. Within the minority Shia community, however, the fraction that sought to ignore group differences altogether dropped to 51%. Apparently, Pakistan's quite dilapidated educational system, committed to denying difference, was not entirely ineffective even among Shias. Turning to the people who actually said that alternative prayer styles and group differences should be mentioned, though, we sought to find out what they meant when they said mention the differences. In particular, we asked people to tell us whether sectarian and doctrinal differences should be mentioned in an effort to distinguish right from wrong, in a sectarian sense, or alternatively, to promote a positive regard for others. At this point, drawing attention to specific forms of doctrinal disputation in the context of madrasas, a form of munazara, 74% of this group, or 19% of the total sample, they said that doctrinal differences should be mentioned primarily to distinguish sectarian truths. In fact, only 26%, and in the context of the larger sample, just 6.8%. Only that group felt that differences should be mentioned to facilitate a positive regard for others, a positive regard for difference and debate within the terms of Islam. Again, I should add that this positive regard for difference was correlated with one's overall level of education. Even among those with a university level of education, however, a BA, an MA, a PhD, the size of this tiny group scarcely exceeded 10%. You can see the correlation, and you can see the size of the group. The main point lies in drawing attention to the fact that this diversity-friendly 6.8% did not derive its ideas from the curriculum conveyed in local schools, nor did it derive its ideas from the work of local madrasas. This group was an outlier, a very interesting and important outlier for those with an interest in the interpretive autonomy of Muslims. Clearly, they had some role themselves in making this happen. So with this in mind, I'm going to turn to the little film that I put together from the research. The film is divided into two parts. The first part features this overwhelming majority that said, ignore the terms of difference. The second part features a tiny minority who sought to embrace the terms of difference. And throughout, you'll notice that demographic characteristics are not terribly revealing. At various points, you'll see that very different people, rich, poor, and so on, seem to share remarkably similar views. Group 1 and Group 2 are not distinguished demographically. Now, the clips I've selected are not statistically representative. They're just illustrative. For example, Part 1, ignore difference, has an overrepresentation of teachers. But it's important to remember that only 6.8% belong with Group 2. Okay? The clips are of equal length. Group 2 is much smaller in reality. If we have time after this little film, perhaps I'll have a chance to read a couple further excerpts from the interviews. And these excerpts try to illuminate the language of that little group that said differences should be embraced. What emerges from these excerpts is not a language of secularism. It's not a language of liberalism. It's not a language of multiculturalism, any of these things. What emerges in many cases is a language of forward movement, a language of proactive religious progress, taraqi, difference as a gateway to discussion, discussion as the precursor of progress. Okay, it's an interesting conceptual landscape. These are the people who seek to embrace the terms of Islam while at the same time avoiding the static temptations of pride. These are the people who insist that the golden age of Islam, both in the past and in the future, was and will forever remain an age of diverse Islamic debate and progress. So let's turn to the film, see what they have to say.
बहुत सारे लोग कहते हैं कि इस्लामियत का मजमून तमाम बच्चों के लिए लाजमी होना चाहिए। अगर इस्लामियत का मजमून लाजमी हो तो क्या सादा इस्लाम के अंदर रहते हुए बच्चों को शिया सुन्नी के बारे में कुछ बताना चाहिए या नहीं?
नहीं, तो फ़रक़ाबाज़ी या मसलक का कुछ नहीं बताना चाहिए। उन्हें इस्लामियात ही पढ़ानी चाहिए, बस दीन के बारे में बताना चाहिए।
अच्छा, हर कोई जानता है हकीकत में तमाम मुसलमान अपनी नमाज मुख्तलिफ तरीके से अदा करते हैं। सुन्नी حضرات کا اپنا طریقہ ہے اور شیعہ حضرات کا اپنا طریقہ ہے. سوال میرا اب یہ ہے کہ آپ سمجھتے ہیں کہ اسلامیت کے سلیبس میں 5ویں کے بعد بچوں کو ان اختلافات کے بارے میں کچھ بتانا چاہیے؟
جی نہیں.
یا کیا سمجھتے ہیں کہ تمام بچوں کو یہ بتایا جائے ان سب کو اپنی نماز ایک طریقے سے ادا کرنا ہے تاکہ مذہبی اختلافات ختم ہو جائیں یا نظر انداز ہو جائیں؟
ہاں بالکل، تقریباً ان کو سب کو جو ہے نا نماز ایک طریقے سے پڑھنی چاہیے اور یہ مذہبی اختلافات یا گروہ بندی جو ہے یہ نہیں ہونی چاہیے.
وہی تو اختلافات ہم نے ختم کرنے ہیں. ایک ہونا چاہیے سب کا. ہاں
جب آپ یہ کہتی ہیں ایک طریقہ نماز ہونا چاہیے، جب ہم بچوں کو اسکولوں میں یہ پڑھانے لگیں گے کہ ایک طریقہ نماز یہ ہے تو ہر کوئی کہے گا میرا طریقہ صحیح ہے، میرا طریقہ صحیح ہے.
بچے کہیں گے. اس بحث کا حال یہ ہے کہ ہم کوشش کریں مختلف قرآن آیات کے حوالے سے حدیث کا حوالہ دے کے ان کو مطمئن کرنے کی کوشش کرے. ایک ٹیچر جو ہمارے حضور پاک نے ہمارے لیے ہیں چھوڑی ہوئی باتیں، تو ان کے حوالے سے ہم بتائیں کہ ایز اے مسلمان، ایک مسلمان کی حیثیت سے ہمیں یہی طریقہ بتایا گیا، اس پہ ہم نے عمل کرنا ہے. تو باقی جو ماحول ہے معاشرے کا یا گھریلو وہ ایک الگ بات ہے. جو ٹیچر کا فرض ہے وہ یہی ہے کہ سب کو ایک جیسا ہی طریقہ بتائے.
وہ میرے خیال ہے اسکولوں میں چند ایک ہوتے ہیں، سارے سنی ہوتے ہیں. میجارٹی
جو میجورٹی کی چیز ہے
جی جی بس وہ بس
مائنورٹی کی چیز کو ٹچ نہیں کیا جائے.
جی جی اس کو نہیں چھیڑنا چاہیے.
ان کی میجورٹی جو بھی ہے
جی جی وہ بھی اب ہے نا، اسکولوں میں ہم دیکھتے ہیں شیعہ سنی اکٹھے پڑھ رہے ہیں، لیکن اسکول میں ایسی کوئی بات نہیں ہوتی کہ ہمارا کلمہ فرق ہے، ہماری نماز فرق ہے. وہ اس چیز کو شو ہی نہیں کرتے.
اچھا، اگر
نہ ہم لوگ ڈسکس کرتے ہیں سنی لوگ.
اگر ہم آپ سے یہ کہیں، فرض کریں کہ اگر ہم مائنورٹی میں ہوں،
جی
اگر ہم سنی بھائی صاحب مائنورٹی میں ہوں، میجورٹی میں شیعہ بھائی ہوں، تو کیا آپ سمجھتے ہیں کہ ہمیں صرف شیعہ کی نماز پڑھنی پڑتی ہے؟ میجورٹی منورٹی کی بات کر رہے ہیں.
ویسے ہوتا تو ایسے نہیں
ہوتا نہیں
دیکھا تو ایسے نہیں ہے. جی جی چند ایک شیعہ طبقہ بیٹھا ہوتا ہے یا کرسچن ہے.
جی جی جی
تقریباً سنی لوگ ہی بیٹھے.
سنی کی نماز پڑھنا چاہیے اس کو.
جی جی سنی.
اس میں اس کا حل یہ ہے کہ ملک میں اکثریت کی رائے کا احترام کیا جائے، یا مذہبی طور پہ جو ہے جو بڑے بڑے مذہبی رہنما ہیں وہ مل بیٹھ کر کوئی ایک طریقے پہ متفق ہوں، یا یہ دیکھ لیں کہ ملک میں اکثریت جو ہے وہ کس طریقہ سے نماز پڑھتی ہے، اس طریقہ کو تمام لوگ مان لیں. یہ تو بڑا ایزی حل ہے، اس کا کوئی ایسی مشکل بات نہیں ہے. اور جو نہ مانے، جو ہٹ درمی کرے، تو اس کو جو ہے گورنمنٹ جو ہے وہ اس کو سزا دے.
بات یہ تھی کہ ہمارے پاس پچھلے سال ایک بچہ کرسچن جو ہے 5ویں جماعت پاس کر کے گیا ہے. میں کہتا ہوں کہ اس نے پوری صورتیں 10 صورتیں تھیں 5ویں جماعت کی، اس نے پوری یاد کی. کہا جہاں تک اس کا عمل، جو عمل کرتا ہے یا نہیں کرتا ہے وہ اس کا اپنے ایک علیحدہ ہے بات، لیکن اس نے کلاس کے ساتھ پوری 10 صورتیں یاد کی، کلمہ شہادت یاد کیا، کلمہ جو کچھ تھا وہ پورا کرتا رہا.
وہ ایک طریقہ ہے نماز جو سب کو قابل قبول ہو، وہ کس طرح بنایا جائے؟
وہ وقت کے تقاضے کے ساتھ جو اسلامی قوانین چل رہے ہیں اس کے مطابق اس کو ڈالنا چاہیے. کیونکہ ایک حکومت ہے، آپ یہ سمجھ لیں کہ ایران میں ہے، وہاں جو ہے سنی کے لیے ان کا اپنا ایک نظام انہوں نے رائج کیا ہے، اسی کے مطابق ہوگی. جہاں ہمارے پاکستان میں کیونکہ ایک نظام چل رہا ہے، سنی نظام چل رہا ہے، اسی کے مطابق ہونا چاہیے.
بہت سارے لوگ کہتے ہیں کہ میرے محلے میں سنی حضرات اور شیعہ حضرات آپس میں بھائیوں کی طرح رہتے ہیں. سنی حضرات کے شیعہ دوست ہیں اور شیعہ حضرات کے سنی دوست ہیں. یہ محلے کی سطح پر بڑا بھائی چارہ نظر آتا ہے، لیکن جب اوور آل سچویشن دیکھتے ہیں پورے پاکستان میں یہ میں لڑتے جھگڑتے نظر آتے ہیں. ایسا کیوں ہے؟ یہ کیوں کرتے ہیں؟
شاید وہی جو میں نے پہلی بات کی ہے کہ ہم لوگوں میں فلیکسیبلٹی نہیں ہے، ایک دوسرے کی بات سننے کی ہم میں طاقت نہیں ہے.
جی.
اگر ہم ایک دوسرے کی بات آسان طریقے سے سن کے ڈسکس کر کے اس کے بعد پہ وہ کیا جائے، ہم سنی سنائی باتوں پہ عمل کرتے ہیں. اور شاید اگر سنی باتوں کو چھوڑ کر ہم حقیقت کی طرف آئیں اور ایک دوسرے کی بات سنیں اور پھر اس کے بعد فیصلہ کریں تو شاید یہ ساری چیزیں ختم ہو جائیں گی.
جس طرح ہمیں ہندو مذہب کے بارے میں کہا جاتا ہے دوسرے فرقات کے بارے میں، تو ہمیں جب وہ ان کے بارے میں وہ علم حاصل ہوگا تبھی ہم اس طرح وہ بیہیور کر سکیں گے اس کے. اب لوگوں کو پتہ نہیں ہوتا ہے، لوگ کہتے ہیں شیعہ کافر ہیں، یہ ہیں وہ ہیں، حالانکہ اس طرح نہیں ہے. वो भी इंसान है, उन्हें हुए अभी जिस तरह हिंदुओं को अपने मज़हब में रहते हुए वो हमारे से जिस तरह वो करते हैं।
खुद हज पड़ा हुआ है, तो मैंने वहाँ देखा है कि बैतुल्लाह के अंदर मैंने 3-4 किस्म के वहाँ लोग नमाज पढ़ते हुए देखे। एक यहाँ पे हाथ बांध के पढ़ रहा है, एक यहाँ पढ़ रहा है, एक नाक के ऊपर है, और एक ने हाथ यूँ छोड़ रखे हैं और दूसरे ने हाथ यूँ छोड़ रखे हैं। जब वहाँ पर तफरीक नहीं है तो हमारे यहाँ क्यों है? मैं तशी हूँ, हम एक ही घर में हाथ छोड़ के मेरे तकरीबन मेरे 5 के 5 बच्चे हाथ बांध के नमाज पढ़ते हैं। मैंने कभी उनको कहा बेटे ये क्या कर रहे हो, उनकी अपनी पसंद है ना, उनकी अपनी चॉइस है। सही हम जब तक बच्चों को ऐसे नहीं छोड़ेंगे वो उनका दिमाग नशोनुमा नहीं पाएगा, वो अच्छी नशोनुमा नहीं पा सकते। सही
अगर अहले हदीस आता है उसकी सुनो, सुन्नी की सबकी सुनो, बात सुनो, फिर किसी नतीजे को अख्ज़ करो आप। ठीक, अब ये नहीं कहें कि ये ईसाई आया तो उनको पुश बैक कर दूँ, या ये तो शिया है, ये काफिर है, ये तो या आप नमाज पढ़ते हैं जी आपकी नमाज ही नहीं ली है। ये सारा काम ये अल्लाह रब्बुल इज़्ज़त ताला का, ये हमारा काम नहीं है। जी ठीक है ना, हमारा काम तो सिर्फ तबलीग करना है, हिदायत देना तो उसका काम है, और ये किसी को काफिर बना देना, किसी को मुसलमान बना देना, ये तो हमारा काम नहीं है। जी
Open it up for questions at this point.
Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation, very revealing film as well. We're going to have a microphone going around, so please wait for it to arrive before you start speaking after I call on you. So see a show of hands and we'll get started. First question? Wow. Yes, okay, we'll start right in the front over here.
Hi, my name's Mariam. So I just have a question about the religious instructor that comes home, because when I was growing up, that's what I had as well, like a Maulvi Saab that would come. So I'm just curious as to what you found out about how that kind of indoctrinate or whatever those ideologies were sort of passed through, because from my experience it was basically I just learned how to read the Quran as a result, but I'm interested in knowing like how further into like, you know, the lesson those at-home instructors went into.
It's a very good question, and I think it gives me an opportunity to speak not just about the mullah who comes home, but also about madrasas generally, because many people will point out that the mullah in particular, and frankly the madrasa curriculum, the Darsi Nizami for instance, does not highlight sectarian or sub-sectarian differences. It's much more generic than that, and particularly the memorization process of the Quran, hifz, and so on, is strictly generic. So where on earth in that process is this acknowledgement of difference that I associate with the mullahs and so on? And the answer is that it is what would be described as extracurricular. In other words, I would suspect that a particular family who happens to be Sunni Baralvi or whatever would call the mullah from their local mosque, which is also a Sunni Baralvi mosque, and that particular mullah in sort of developing the relationship with the family, but also with the children that happen to attend the mosque for reading the Quran, if they do that in the mosque, or if they happen to run a madrasa, the sort of accoutrement of the institution and of that mullah's particular orientation would reflect that sectarian perspective. So, to help those of you who are not familiar with these distinctions understand what that could mean, one of the key areas of distinction between these different groups of Sunnis, for instance, is with reference to the attendance at shrines to reflect upon one's religiosity and piety. And for Baralvis, the shrine plays a very important part in providing a location for that type of reflection. And for Deobandi Sunnis, the shrine is not a place that figures prominently in their religious expression. And so for Ahl Hadith or Salafi Sunnis in Pakistan, not only is it not the shrine, but also the intervening role of a Sufi sheikh or something would also sort of stand beyond the pale of what they regard as acceptable. None of these distinctions would come through in the simple reading of the Quran, as you've correctly pointed out. But families that engage a mullah or students who attend a particular madrasa, they will encounter these particular value structures in that location and through the particular perspective of the religious leader that they run across. So drawing that distinction between what is curricular in the context of the madrasa and what is simply extracurricular, I think is quite important to keep in mind.
Let me ask you a question. Would you say that the figures you brought out, especially the very small percentage that accepts religious diversity, does this essentially explain, in your view, why there's been such little support for revising Pakistan's so-called blasphemy laws, and perhaps why two prominent government supporters of religious minorities have been killed or were killed earlier this year?
To link this particular work on religious education to the specific blasphemy issue is a bit challenging, but I'm going to give it a try. Okay. The assassination of Salman Taseer, governor of Punjab, who was outspoken in his defense of a Christian woman who was accused of and subsequently convicted of blasphemy, and her case was on appeal, created an opportunity, I think, for people to come into the streets, as it were, after Salman Taseer's assassination, and articulate their religious bona fides by showing that they will defend Islam publicly. That particular occasion did not necessarily break down so easily in some of the sectarian ways that I've referred to, although I could suggest ways it might. More importantly, it drew attention to the notion of we are all Muslim, and we are all Muslim together in one way. And it provided a public performance space for articulating that particular orientation, which is, as I've indicated, more characteristic of the public school approach to doctrinal or religious difference than that of the madrasa. So the solidarity that you saw in support of the assassin of Salman Taseer was, I would say, an extension of some of the unfortunate implications that grow out of the public school curriculum in Pakistan, more than an articulation of differences within Islam. It was not an occasion for articulating the differences within Islam. On the contrary, it was an opportunity for articulating solidarity within Islam. We should also keep in mind, however, that many cases of blasphemy that involve Christians and others involve Ahmadis and so on and so forth. And these are sort of touchstones for drawing these competing approaches to the question of difference into the public sphere.
I'll just go to you, sir, with the blue shirt. I think it's blue. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Azi Hussain. I was wondering, did you find what would be some of your recommendations in maybe creating curiosity to learn about differences, or this sense that Pakistanis, I noticed that myself, but huge denial of differences and things like that. So is there any recommendations?
Yeah, the policy implication, as it were, of what I found. If you'll, does somebody have that handout with the excerpt from the Constitution? Here we are. I'll just read this little piece from the Pakistan Constitution to you. This is from Part 2 of the Constitution, which is from the section on fundamental rights and principles of policy. Section 31 is called the Islamic way of life, and Part 2 of that says, the state shall endeavor to make the teaching of the Holy Quran and Islamiyat compulsory. The state shall endeavor to promote unity and the observation of Islamic moral standards. It goes on in Section 33, more importantly, to say the state shall discourage parochial and sectarian prejudices among the citizens. Okay. Previously, when I've discussed some of this work, people have said, if there is a constitutional requirement to discourage sectarian prejudices among the citizens, doesn't that require the state to persist in denying difference? In other words, how could you introduce a policy alternative in the face of this constitutional prescription? And my reply is that discouraging parochial and sectarian prejudices does not automatically require you to ignore difference. In fact, discouraging parochial and sectarian prejudices could involve familiarizing people with difference so that their prejudice is not enacted in the way that it is currently. From my research, what I found is that turning to the public sector curriculum for solutions in the current context will be extremely difficult. Turning to most of the ulama, or the religious leaders, will also be quite difficult. Where I've begun to look is the particular narratives, the particular conceptual landscapes of this 6.8%. I do think that collecting these stories, the experiences reflected in religious terms of these people, will provide us with some sort of something tangible in a Pakistan context that will provide us a foundation for encouraging this sort of orientation. So I mentioned that I might read a couple little excerpts from these interviews where people say, I think these differences should be recognized. These are the types of little stories that I think are extremely helpful, and I think they could feed into textbook vignettes. I think they could feed into storylines in media settings, whether it's on television or other types of media where people can hear these narratives. One person says, difference gives rise to argumentation, and that's the stage of development, not only for the religion itself, but also for the people. Development comes only with differences. This shows the flexibility of Islam. Another person said, there should be different opinions. If there are no different opinions, then life will become very difficult. And the second thing is that our religion will simply remain fixed in one place. Difference is the reason religion goes ahead. The interviewer says, you mean progresses? He said, yes. If there are no differences, well, our religion will just stay in one place. It shouldn't be like that. This is like being an enemy to religion. Another person says, the religion has to remain viable, to keep going on through the centuries, so the culture and traditions have to keep on changing. And the differences that have come in through history, each culture has its own interpretation. The Arabs came, then after the Arabs, the Turkish, and so on. If you go to different parts of the country, there are many different interpretations. This is just part of the tradition. You see, religion is like the inside of a mold. It takes shape according to the local culture. Okay. What I find in these stories that people are telling me when they have this particular orientation is a particular language, a particular sort of set of concepts that they package in a particular way that I think will make sense potentially to other people who do not already share that orientation. What I'm doing is harvesting some of that conceptual apparatus in this work, and I think it could feed into some narratives in other locations.
Yes, right up here.
Bob Hathaway here at the center. Matt, I'm still not fully clear on how strong is the perception of sectarian differences. I'm, for instance, not sure to what extent sectarian violence is supported by the proverbial man on the street. If you put some of these disagreements, religious-based disagreements, into, say, an American context, they might be at the level of differences between Episcopalians and Presbyterians, or the way I would define it, at any rate, slightly broader gap, say, between Protestants and Catholics, or a broader yet gap, say, between Christians and non-Christians. I don't want you to get stuck in an American stereotype, but can you give us a better sense of how the typical Pakistani, who probably exposes his or her children both to the state mode of education and the mullah education, how strongly they feel about these things?
I would say the typical Pakistani is deeply, deeply distressed by sectarian conflict and sectarian violence in Pakistan. What's interesting is the challenge that faces them when they want to respond to that. What they find is one of the most common little phrases that I would hear in the context of all of these interviews is, "Ek Musliman dusre Muslimanon ko nahi mar sakte hain." One Muslim cannot hurt another Muslim. Okay? The idea is that how could this sectarian conflict have anything to do with Islam? Islam means we are all Muslim, we are all one. Okay? And at that point, they look forward to a future in which sectarian difference disappears. And they fall back on the idea of unity, consensus, ijma, conformity, and so on. And then it's just one more simple step to say, well, I want to be included in that unity, and my way of being Muslim should be prioritized. And it feeds back into exactly the thing that they are so distressed about. I think it's essential to map this thought process so you can understand that the intention to distance oneself from sectarian violence is sincere and widespread. And yet the putting into practice of a particular conceptual orientation does not necessarily facilitate the realization of that intention. And understanding how that mechanism works is part of what I'm trying to do here. So when, for instance, you will see someone confronted with a sectarian massacre, and sadly this happens far too frequently in Pakistan in recent years, people will immediately say, this has nothing to do with Islam. This must be the work of outsiders. It's the work of India, it's the work it's the work of the Israelis, it's the work of the Americans, it's the work of some foreigner. It can't possibly have anything to do with Islam. We are all Muslim, we are all one. And again, what I see this as just, again, my work is focused on ideas. So it's a conceptual block. The idea of unity in Islam simply does not accommodate that observed reality with a sense of direct community responsibility. People will, again, this occurs in studies of ethnic conflict around the world. People will say, we've noticed this violence, and they'll say, it doesn't happen in my neighborhood. That happened in the next alleyway. And I think, understanding how those ideas in some ways could actually facilitate some of the practice itself, or at least find it extremely difficult to resist said practice, is really important.
Is there any difference between Sunni and Shia
No.
thinking on these things?
I'm afraid not in my research. I think one of the most striking findings was that 51% of Shia who still said, don't mention difference. It was interesting and I think relevant that number fell. It was no longer 65% saying ignore difference, it was 51%. This is a minority realizing that it is a minority and that appreciating or allowing some space for difference is important for them. Simultaneously, we have the statistics saying that more than half were still convinced that the way to unity lies through homogenization. It's a powerful narrative. We have it here in this country too.
All right, let's go to the back. And we had someone with a hand up for a while. The woman all the way in the back, yes. Just wait for the mic.
I'm from Relief International, and we're doing very different work, not on the academic side, but relief and development work in Pakistan. And I'm, on a personal level, very intrigued by the notion of the sectarian violence question, but also what you were mentioning about this idea of letting people sort of, through vignettes, through reflection and stories that could be shared maybe through dramas or television, or if that could even be possible, to really speak to each other and listen. You're talking about listening to each other, and it's very much of a liberation theology approach that interests me, that's worked in Latin America. But taking that kind of reflection and praxis approach, is very interesting and powerful if you could get that to happen. We're not necessarily able to do that in our work, but when you were talking about public education and the curriculum and what can sort of cut through, what we're doing is libraries. About 200 or so, where it's a secular, there's no curriculum actually, it's just access to poetry, to literature that's from within the culture but isn't necessarily about the religious experience or that part of the culture, in order to just offer something alternative. And the demand for this is so huge that I was interested to get a sense from you if something it's not specific. Do you know what I mean? It's addressing the idea of difference and finding place for unity in a different way, or homogeneity in a different way. But in a sense, it's just offering different voices than you may be getting in a more parochial context, but voices from within the culture. Now, we're seeing this as a very high demand, so much so that we're trying to do more and trying to find a way to do it. So I'd be curious from what you think may or may not be successful. You were talking about this use of the vignettes, in the liberation theology mode. Is something like community libraries that offer non-parochial material. In your experience, in your research, does that have a place? We're finding it does, but you've obviously gone deeper in your investigation.
It's a big question. What is the practical application of some of these with reference to institutions like libraries or media generally, and what is the Pakistan-specific best option? I would say that I haven't actually looked at the relative demand for community libraries versus other types of institutions. I would say simply anecdotally that I'm not surprised that there's a demand for community libraries, particularly in much less affluent communities where the access to books, even textbooks, frankly, is inadequate. So I can't see any argument against community libraries. I would say that generally in terms of scope, the media explosion in Pakistan should not be ignored here. And the ways in which people consume media, all the way from an expanding group accessing the internet, not just the elite anymore, but moving well into the middle and lower middle classes, through, of course, television and radio and so on. I think that those venues should be stressed. I can't see why some of the television dramas that are so popular in various parts of Pakistan cannot be encouraged to weave in some of these storylines and some of this language. I haven't looked into it myself, but having watched television dramas, I think that they're complex and they have rich storylines and there's all kinds of room there. You mentioned liberation theology, and I would say that my experience and my particular approach to this is less through theology than another word that you used, which is praxis. There are, certainly in Britain, I've spoken to people in the Foreign Office, for instance, who are eager to sort of team up with particular religious scholars, alims or ulama, to encourage them to channel particular messages into their institutional context. And I don't actually see picking scholarly winners on the part of the Foreign Office as a subtle way to go about messaging in Pakistan. What I'm trying to do is really gather the day-to-day language that people use to, frankly, justify to themselves and also defend, occasionally publicly, a very rare view. And some of the questions that we ask people are, what happens when you articulate this particular orientation to embracing difference and other people don't like it? And most of our respondents will say, yes, this is a very unusual view in my community, but I'm an eccentric person, or but I have friends that sort of I can talk to. And, situating this really at the level of routine practice as opposed to something more conceptually sophisticated like theology, which I don't necessarily, that's not an area I work in. You mentioned poetry. One cannot overstate the importance of poetry among Muslims in South Asia. Certainly when I was learning Urdu, we had to learn the poetry of Ghalib, we had to learn the poetry of Fez, and so on and so forth. And I thought, oh, this is very difficult and very tedious, and I was astonished to find the number of contexts in Pakistan where I found myself drawing out my few verses of Ghalib to share when everybody was sharing their verses of poetry in a million different contexts. What's interesting and important about poetry, and I didn't actually imagine that I would be making a pitch for poetry in this talk, but it's directly relevant. One of the most touching interviews involved a person, an older man, who tried to explain his point of view, his unusual point of view, the 6.8% point of view, by saying, it's just like poetry. Certainly, when you encounter a verse of poetry, there's just one verse, but there are many meanings. And then the verse becomes even more beautiful. And it actually inspired what is a very important framing for my whole project, which is to distinguish the language of e pluribus unum, in one, out of diversity there is just one, e pluribus unum, and instead to stress my alternative, which is in uno pluris, in one Islam, there are many. And his little reflection on the multiple interpretive expressions of a single verse of poetry helped me understand what that could mean. Because certainly if you look to India's motto, unity and diversity, and really stressing the diversity, is not something that would play as well in Pakistan. They're stressing in one Islam, there are many Muslims, which is very much what people tend to say. And that is very nicely reflected in the way people engage with poetry in Pakistan. I think it's important.
Yes, in the back, the gentleman just put his glasses on. Yeah.
My name is Farid Dosani. You mentioned that the state schools and the private elite schools, the curricula is one. I assume you meant the religious curricula. The question I have is, in the madrasas, what is the emphasis and how extensive is the non-religious curricula? And just secondly, a quick second question is, roughly what percentage in your research have you come across, what percentage of the school-going sort of population as a whole of Pakistan is actually enrolled in schools of all types, madrasas and state and private? Is it a very high percentage? Because we keep hearing that the literacy rate is 50% or less, but of course that doesn't mean the school-going literacy rate is that. Just to give us an idea of that. Thank you.
Okay. With reference to sort of actually the three questions that were there. First, the common curriculum was not necessarily between the public schools and the elite private schools. The common curriculum was between the public schools and many of these very, very inexpensive non-elite private schools. They often use similar textbooks to prepare their kids for the same government exams. But your first key question was about the non-religious education in the madrasa. And there's all kinds of emphasis on increasing the coverage of English language, mathematics, computer science, and so on in the madrasa. And I can say that that sort of addition to the curriculum is very much there, is expanding, that the ulama who run many madrasas are interested in bringing in new subjects into their schools, and they want to do that on their own. The government had a big push to try to regulate the curriculum in madrasas and in some cases incentivize changes in the curriculum in the madrasa, and it flopped because the madrasas wanted to defend their institutional autonomy. Having defended their institutional autonomy, many did proceed with this, we'll call it a balancing of the curriculum between their dini subjects, the religious subjects, and their dunyavi subjects, the worldly subjects, which will include mathematics and so on. So if I were to sort of put figures on this, it would be very difficult. What percentage is covered by that? The 6.8% that I'm stressing in the previous work was 8%. So basically this indicates astonishing stability, frankly, over when you consider that in the last 2-3 years, level of sectarian violence and the number of attacks involving some type of religious conflict and so on is up. This is a stable statistic. And so that's interesting, I think. The demographic distribution that we find with the 6.8% is also very interesting. It is not skewed in favor of the rich. It is not skewed in favor of the urban. It is not skewed in favor of minorities, the Shia or others. What's remarkable about the data here is that the demographic predictors that we tend to rely on for explaining levels of tolerance and so on do not seem to be terribly significant. This, I think, should help social scientists generally, or should encourage social scientists generally, to relax some of their reliance on demographic predictors and to look a little bit more deeply with respect to some of the really important issues. The 6.8%, I noted at the end, does correlate, the inclination to embrace difference does correlate with levels of education. Okay, that is a demographic predictor. But I tried to stress that the explanatory power of education, the more education you get means the more inclined to embrace difference you are, is actually pretty weak overall. Our university educated group barely broke through the 10%, that demographic group barely broke through 10% inclined to embrace difference. So I think this is reassuring for those who think that bringing people through to higher levels of education is a positive step. I think there is evidence for that in this research. But in this particular case, we shouldn't overstate its impact.
Okay, yes, sir.
My name is Hassan, and I wonder if my question will relate to what you have done. In your field work, I mean, you must have extensive contact within the madrasas and the people, as you've shown in the movie too. My question to you is, are these madrasas, the perception in the West is that these are dens of terrorists, or they produce terrorists, and did anyone sort of articulate these kind of views, anti-Western, and previously it used to be anti-Indian mostly. Now, especially after 9/11, there was a lot of talk about changing the curriculum in these madrasas. Has that been done, or it is just at the face value? And the whole idea of this unity is mostly rhetorical and not in substance.
I should say that the interviews that we did were not initiated with reference to particular schools. So we didn't necessarily go to a madrasa and interview some people in that context, go to a school, interview people in that context. We simply visited people generally. And so I can't necessarily say that the data tells us something specific about the ways in which madrasas may or not be associated with terrorism. However, after conducting this research for so many years, I think it is extremely important to point out that madrasas generally in Pakistan are not dens of terrorism. I think it is at the same time extremely important to point out that under Zia-ul Haq during the 1980s, in the context of the Afghan jihad, some madrasas were definitely converted into factories for jihad. The number of madrasas that I speak to with reference to this transformation in the 1980s is relatively small. When we paint with a broad brush a story about madrasas and terrorism in Pakistan, we do far more damage than good. Madrasas, in my research, amount to something like Sunday school in the US. They're everywhere. People send their kids for religious education. If you're a Muslim in Pakistan, it's a good idea to teach your kid to learn to read the Quran. It's routine. To somehow take that routine and tell a story about dens of terrorism is extremely counterproductive with reference to engaging the public in Pakistan, needless to say. We have to recognize, however, that there are particular locations where training for violent engagements is occurring. And I think we can locate those particular institutions and take targeted concern, or proceed with targeted concern. With reference to anti-Indian and anti-Western sentiment, particularly anti-Indian sentiment, my research indicates that we generally shouldn't look so much to the madrasa, we should look to the public school curriculum for that. The public school curriculum is pretty explicit about concerns about India, concerns about Hindus, and so on. And it was not difficult for people to recall their lessons in public school about the separation from India in 1947 and the characterization of Hindus in India in that context, and painting fairly grotesque generalized pictures about India through the public school curriculum. This is not to say that anti-Indian sentiments don't exist in the madrasas, but at a level of explicit curricular content, the madrasas aren't the place to look for that. It's really the public school curriculum.
Let's see. Yes, sir, you've not asked the question yet. Right on the other side of the room. Over here.
My name is Umar. I am a visiting fellow at Stimson Center. I want your comment on the idea by some of the researchers that the religious education in Pakistan has expanded far beyond the madrasas or the Islamia textbooks. So there have been now prevalent modes of education and social transformation. Tablighi Jamaat, the preachers are one. Dr. Sadaf at LUMS, she has done a dissertation on Al-Huda, a social transformation organization by Jamaat Islami, and there are many more than our media, which has started so many religious channels. And we saw that after the assassination of Governor Tasir, that the unlikely of the classes, like the lawyers and even teachers and the government servants, they kind of came openly. So do you see any trend in that direction, like the emphasis from this new generation who might have forgotten the Islamic books, but they have some other modes of radicalization?
This, let's call it a new generation of religious education, which in my sort of book manuscript, I refer to them as Islamic academies. And so you'll have Al-Huda schools, for instance. You will have the Jamaat Islami schools, and so on and so forth. And the number of these private, frankly, relatively elite Islamic schools in Pakistan is absolutely growing. The prestige of a high fee charging school that also provides explicit emphasis on religious education. The cachet of such schools is expanding in Pakistan, and these schools, again, cater to a relatively small proportion of the student population, but they are extremely, extremely important. What's interesting about them is that in many cases, they actually map back onto some of the sub-sectarian distinctions that we saw in the madrasas. You will see the establishment of an elite Islamic academy with a Barelvi orientation, with a Jamaati orientation, with a Deobandi orientation. And what this indicates to me is that of late, say in the last couple decades, the social value, the prestige attached to a madrasa education has declined, and the social value or the prestige of an English medium education has increased. And you see, at some level, a market-driven expansion of some religious groups into this type of education. And so you will find, for instance, the establishment of an Al-Huda school. Al-Huda is a difficult example. Let me talk more about the Jamaat schools, which the Jamaati sort of ideology certainly has a presence in the public school curriculum, but they now have their own network of elite Islamic academies in various parts of Pakistan, and they have considerable cachet. They charge very high fees in some cases. And I think these schools should not necessarily be a completely separate category from what I discussed here. What you see instead are some of the same subsectarian distinctions played out in a more elite context, where English is sometimes the medium of instruction for a mixed curriculum of religious and non-religious subjects, in a school that still maintains some particular sectarian orientation. You mentioned Tablighi Jamaat. Tablighi Jamaat is different. Tablighi Jamaat does not establish schools. Tablighi Jamaat is an incredibly compelling community, a movement, global in scope, that has an educative element insofar as it teaches people to practice Islam, encourages people to practice Islam in a particular way, and people feel a sense of solidarity within the Tablighi Jamaat that they are practicing Islam in the same way. But it's not, and one of the interesting things about the Tablighi Jamaat is that it's not institutionalized in the same way that many of the madrasas have been. In fact, the founder of the Tablighi Jamaat, Muhammad Elias, in the 20s, was extremely explicit about distinguishing his particular focus from the focus of the madrasa. He was frustrated with the ulama based in the madrasa. He regarded them as antiquated, dusty, crusty old religious scholars, and he was going to develop a more dynamic movement. He was also quite frustrated with the Sufis and their Sufi lodges. He wanted to sort of develop a movement in between the madrasa and the Sufi khanqa or lodge. And so he developed the Tablighi Jamaat. They don't have schools.
Yes.
My name is Zulfikar Hantanoli, and actually I was born in the most backward area of Pakistan, very close to tribal area, very conservative and very, religious folks that live there. And my parents never went to school, but every morning they will send me and my brothers to masjid to learn Quran, and in the evening they will do so too. The first time I learned about Sunni and Shia when I've done my high school, and I wanted to join a college, and the college principal was an army officer, retired army officer, and he asked me, "What are you? Who are you?" I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "Your faith." I said, "I'm Muslim." He said, "No, how do you pray?" Then I told him how I prayed, and he said, "Oh, you're Sunni."
Right.
So the point here is, and when I actually traveled to Karachi, and I've seen on the walls of Pakistan, on the small streets, on very narrow alleys where it's written Shia Kafir, like Shia is non-Muslim, or Sunni Kafir. Don't you think that this Shia Sunni especially, this is the major conflict, you will agree with me, is more like political? It's more like, to gain kind of power, or, because how many people truly follow Shia and Sunnis, like this violent campaign that is ongoing, especially during Muharram al-Haram? I mean, it's just, to me, I mean, this is just my opinion, and please correct me if I'm wrong. It's only very tiny percent of people in Pakistan who actually give too much priority to Shiaism or Sunniism, and then actually to for political gain they kind of start killing each other. Or is it like majority of the Pakistani who actually view Sunni is Sunniism better than Shiaism?
Right. One of my favorite types of Muslims in Pakistan is exactly the Muslim you've described. This is the Sunni Shia. The Sunni Shia is the same kind of Muslim as the Deobandi Barelvi. This is a person who says, I grew up in a Deobandi family, and although I grew up in a Deobandi family, I love to go to the shrine. I love to sit in the shrine. It gives me a sense of peace. I don't really care that much about the saint who's buried in that shrine, but I really find it to be an attractive location. My father says I'm a kafir. Okay? This is a person who grew up in a Deobandi family. That Deobandi family doesn't necessarily pay attention to the shrine. This person has an attraction to the atmosphere in the shrine and visits the shrine because it has value for them. And if you ask them, what are you? They'll say, I'm a Deobandi Barelvi. And I think this is absolutely the most common type of Muslim in Pakistan. What's interesting is when I would talk to a number of people about doctrinal matters, how do you pray? Do you pray with your hands folded? Do you pray with your hands open, etc.? They'll say, well, this is what I do. And if you'll ask them, is it Sunni, is it Shia? They'll say, aapko kisi maulvi se baat karna padti. Mujhe bilkul nahi malum. I have no idea. You're going to have to ask a maulvi. Okay? Now, Does this indicate to me that there's no difference? No, absolutely not. It does not indicate to me that there is no difference in the form of expression or at the level of cognition or at the level of conceptualization in Pakistan. Difference is everywhere. What's interesting to me is the way in which people conceptualize this fact. And many people will say, "Aapko kisi Maulvi se baat karna chahiye," right? I have no idea, ask a Maulvi. My Islam is what I do without thinking carefully. But if you inquire more deeply, they will be able to articulate how the way they pray is a little bit different from the way their friend prays, and so on and so forth. This indicates to me kind of like hybrid enrollments. The religious landscape in Pakistan is hybridized. It is extremely complex. It is fluid. It is not segmented in the way that we often think if we look at sectarian attacks and we think communities are pitted against one another waiting to attack. Not at all. There are, however, many madrasas. There are religious parties. There are people who are building institutions, building parties, building constituencies, building communities. Frankly, just like our local vicar who's trying to sort of recruit people to his parish, they need to sort of bring in the community to increase the financial sort of take of their particular institution, and they have an interest in drawing these distinctions. They will say the best way to Islam is our way to Islam, join our community. Okay, does that mean that the differences are just politics? I don't actually think they're just politics either, because people are making choices. They're making choices about whether to go attend Friday prayers with this mullah or that mullah, and so on. They're attracted at different points in their lives to different types of expression of Islam. The differences are there, and they manifest themselves with reference to this power politics in ways that I think suggest responsibility both for the elite manipulator and for the individual Muslim. And I think sort of understanding that mechanism in this landscape of fluidity is extremely important. We often tend to categorize very strictly and think that these categories are quite rigid and unchanging. I think that is deeply problematic.
Okay, last question.
I work very closely with madrasas in Pakistan, so I think it's very interesting, your analysis. If the problem is as big as you are saying, and I think it really is about appreciating differences or understanding and denial of it, all of the Western approaches so far has been very anecdotal, obviously, to increase the level of pluralism, to increase the level of appreciation for very thick diversity that Pakistan enjoys. Obviously, you know, there's ethnic, very rich ethnic diversity and a sectarian diversity. The government programs do work in Pakistan. As dysfunctional as Pakistani government seems to be, whenever Ziaul Haq won it, or Musharraf won it, there was a level of large level consciousness that was raised towards Shias or Sunnis. So the government policies do work in some way to raise consciousness of the society. In the United States, I mean, we are required to give diversity training if you have more than 50 employees, or you won't get money from the federal government, right? Okay, but in Western countries, you kind of had to go through some huge institutional policy framework to get pluralism, at least at some level of awareness level, where people can say, well, the differences exist, and I can sit with you and disagree with you and not kill you, right? And we went through that huge thing painfully in the United States as well. Why would we think, and I hear a lot of these presentations, I'm sorry, but we hear very anecdotal approaches from scholars in the West that somehow cute programming of, you know, do the theater arts in Pakistan and somehow that's going to raise the, I understand civil society have a play, but why we do not talk about a much more robust approach which really is needed in Pakistan from a policy perspective that can really bring in this level of competency within institutions. So, for example, if every teacher has to go through some minimum level of training. Everybody has to go through, sexism training in America, and there is a reason for it, and or race and things of that sort. Why couldn't we recommend some level of intervention from a government perspective and fund it?
Thanks.
Okay. This is where I present the magic bullet to address what I have described as a very, very large problem. First, some historical perspective. One part of my project involves looking at the late 40s, the 50s, and the 60s. Okay? The formation of Pakistan introduced an opportunity for constructing a national narrative, and as I mentioned in the talk, there was a leading educationist, Fazlur Rahman, who introduced the ideology of Pakistan. Okay, the ideology of Pakistan was code for Islam, and particularly a state interpretation of Islam. Subsequently, in the 1950s, there were riots targeting the Ahmadis, but there were very deadly riots, particularly in Punjab. And there was a very famous sort of inquiry and a document prepared called the Munir Report, which basically says the state cannot declare who is and who is not a Muslim in Pakistan. Okay? Now, this was after the Constitution itself declared that the state of Pakistan will be involved in encouraging the Islamization of the country. Now, by 1953, I mean, we are 6 years after the formation of Pakistan. Pakistan is already on the horns of a dilemma. Do we follow the Munir Report and say the state can't decide who isn't a Muslim? We can encourage, in fact, the state can either step aside, or it could actively encourage different approaches to Islam, or should the state sort of encourage the ideology of Pakistan, a nation-building narrative, stitching all the communities together and creating one Islam? Pakistan is on the horns of a dilemma. Along comes the 60s. In the 1960s, Fazlur Rahman, a different Fazlur Rahman, same name, different guy, Fazlur Rahman, a philosopher, is working very closely with the president, dictator of Pakistan, Ayub Khan, and they are going to try together to address and modernize the religious education structure of Pakistan. And Ayub Khan sort of designates Fazlur Rahman to develop a pluralism-friendly approach to religious education in Pakistan, and frankly, education generally. Now, Fazlur Rahman grew to be, and is certainly regarded one of the 20th century's most important Muslim philosophers when it comes to understanding the flexibility and dynamism of Islam. Spent most of his academic career at the University of Chicago. He tried to introduce a pluralism-friendly approach to thinking about Islam with direct relevance to Islamic education, with the endorsement of Ayub Khan in the 60s, and the president and dictator of Pakistan. Totally failed. Totally and catastrophically failed, with leadership from the highest levels of the state in an extremely centralized state. If you're going to have a state that can see through a pattern of change, this was the moment. And it totally failed because the public wasn't with him. And the public had two parts in the 1960s. It had the Jamaat-e-Islami. Okay, the Jamaat-e-Islami was absolutely bitterly against the modernizing narrative, the modernizing religious narrative of Ayub Khan. The Jamaat-e-Islami said, we have the alternative modernizing religious narrative of Islam in Pakistan, and we are going to bitterly oppose Ayub Khan. Okay? Simultaneously, you have the public. And the public was deeply suspicious of Ayub Khan as a puppet of the United States. Ayub Khan, in the context of the Cold War, was very growing closer and closer to the United States, and was very strongly supported by the United States. And many people suspected that his modernizing Islamic agenda in Pakistan was led by folks in Washington who wanted to see this take shape. It didn't fly with the public. I think this is revealing for those of us today who are sitting in Washington, looking for ways to encourage an alternative approach to diversity-friendly Islam in Pakistan. I think one of the things that we heard this afternoon in a talk here at the Wilson Center was that, it's important to stress that Pakistan is a sovereign country, and Pakistan has an Islamic identity that it will work through, and initiating from this room, a particular solution to how to deal with diversity in Pakistan will be very, very difficult. What I've tried to do is gather these little narratives that I think embed some of these ideas in the language that already exists in Pakistan. And then hopefully encourage some people to pick those up and do with them things that will have a wider impact. Your question was very much about scale. How can we reach Pakistan as a whole? Surely we have to rely on the state. I would agree, actually, that we have to rely on the state in large measure. The public schools of Pakistan, as dilapidated, as ineffective as we know them to be, are still extremely influential, as we can see in the views articulated by my respondents. Improving the state schools is essential. The World Bank is telling us every day that we need to encourage private sector initiative in education. Let 1,000 flowers bloom. However, the World Bank is not necessarily paying attention to the curriculum as much as simply encouraging the private sector to build new schools. And the curriculum remains closely tied to the state in Pakistan. It brings us back to the importance of the state. When it comes to practical forms of engagement, you mentioned teacher training. And then, of course, there's the curriculum. Everyone knows that teachers are very poorly trained in Pakistan. To work through the teacher training apparatus to achieve a level of scale for reform in Pakistan is an admirable goal, and I would certainly encourage every effort to do it, but it is a very long-term goal. Right now, Pakistan is more concerned about encouraging teachers to show up as opposed to simply drawing their salaries and running ghost schools where they never turn up. Working through teacher training to bring about reform is important, but a long-term goal. The curriculum is extremely sensitive. It is a holy space, almost literally, for the government of Pakistan. And international engagement at the level of curriculum is incredibly challenging and would need to be pursued with kid gloves. However, having said that, if there is one area that I do think has an impact, it's textbooks. Kids read them. They are dry as dust. But they are an incredibly important resource even now in Pakistan. The exam system, students prepare for exams. They prepare for government exams and so on and so forth. Those exams are drawn out of books. Memorize your book, pass your exam. Memorize your book, pass your exam. Congratulations as you move through the system. The textbooks really do matter. Textbook boards are now, and well, always have been, but are now highlighted as a provincial subject. You have to be prepared to work in all the different parts of Pakistan separately. Punjab, Sindh, Frontier, etc. If that's what it takes, textbooks still matter. I would say, let's talk about textbooks.
All right, well, on that note, we're going to need to wrap up. So if you could, let's all give a round of applause for Matt Nelson. Thank you very much. We're now adjourned.